All right. Well, we're a few minutes after start, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. As I said, thank you everyone for coming to our second webinar in our Growing Inside the Box webinar series. Today, we're going to be covering diving into nutrient delivery a little more specifically. So, for those of y'all that attended our first webinar, some of this information will be very similar to what you learned in the first webinar, just to kind of go over some really important key points again. And then we're also going to talk about some new material as well. This webinar also will be much shorter than the first one. I know the first one was a lot to go over in a little bit of time, but hopefully this one will be shorter and we'll have a good bit of time at the end for some Q&A so that y'all could get your questions in and we can really go into some things that you want to know. So, a little bit about me. I am the CEA technical specialist here at Jack's Fertilizer. I've been here for a little over 3 years. And before that, I received a couple of degrees in horticulture from, down here in the South. So my master's really focused on hydroponic nutrient solutions and nutrient replenishment. So, whenever it comes to vertical farms and recirculating systems, I'm really interested in making sure that we find the right match for y'all and getting good fertilizer, good nutrition to help you grow quality plants. So, we're going to be covering three main topics today. The first is going to be how to select the right fertilizer. The second topic is going to be really understanding nutrient solution dynamics, what that means, and how you manage your solutions over time. And then the last topic we're going to be covering is really going over the importance of raw materials and the raw material quality in the fertilizers that you do select for your plants. So, jumping right into it, let's talk about selecting the right fertilizer. There are several factors to consider whenever you're selecting a fertilizer, and the big three are going to be the crop type, the system type, and your source water. So you want to take all of these factors into account whenever you're trying to select a fertilizer. So the first obstacle that we kind of face is the crop type. What type of crop are you going to be growing? Because different crops have different nutrient requirements. And for most of these systems, we can break out the crop type into two main types, being vegetative and fruiting crops. Vegetative crops are going to include most of your leafy greens, a lot of your herbs. And then fruiting crops, some of the most common ones, especially in CEA, are going to be tomatoes, peppers, and cucumbers. There are several other fruiting crops that people grow, especially hydroponically. I've seen squash, eggplant, you name it, people are growing it. But the big three are really going to be tomatoes, peppers, and cucumbers. So for vegetative crops, as I said, the main crops that you're looking at are going to be mostly leafy greens, some herbs, and then there is kind of a big group within leafy greens, and that's the brassicas that we really want to focus on as they have some kind of specific nutrient requirements. So for most vegetative crops, we're going to be shooting for a pH between 5.8 and 6.2. This is where the nutrients are going to be the most soluble and the most available for your plants to be able to take them up. And vegetative crops as a whole generally have lower nutrient requirements. They're considered light feeders. So your EC is going to be a little bit lower than it would be with a like a fruiting crop. So usually our target EC for leafy greens and herbs is going to be between 1.5 to 2. And then you also want to consider general environmental factors, anything that makes these plants stand out from other plants. Most vegetative crops are going to prefer lower temperatures, um, specifically leafy greens. Whenever the temperatures get a little bit too high, they tend to bolt, flower. They're really not going to do well and stay vegetative under higher temperatures. And then I mentioned brassicas. Brassicas as a whole tend to take up a lot of sulfur. That's kind of what gives them their really distinctive flavor. And, as some of you, I'm sure, have noticed their distinctive smell. But that's just something to be mindful of as solution recirculates and you're looking at the nutrients that are in your solution. Some brassicas tend to really accumulate sulfur a good bit. So having a lot of sulfur in your nutrient solution isn't necessarily a bad thing. And then if we were to look at fruiting crops like tomatoes, peppers, and cucumbers, these are going to have slightly different nutrient requirements. So the pH range for most fruiting crops is a little bit broader than with leafy greens. You usually can stretch it to more of a 5.5 to 6.5 range and still have all those nutrients be perfectly soluble and available for those plants to take up. And then fruiting crops tend to be heavier feeders than leafy greens and vegetative crops. They have higher nutrient demands, and so your EC is generally going to run higher, closer to about 2 to 3. And what makes fruiting crops a little bit more complicated compared to leafy greens is that they do have multiple growth stages, and these individual growth stages are going to change its nutrient demands over time. So many fruiting crops have higher phosphorus and potassium requirements as those plants start to flower and set fruit and the fruit starts to mature. Those nutrient demands are going to change to ensure that the plant is really, growing and producing the way that you want it to. The second factor that we want to consider is your system type, how your system runs, what you're growing, and how the solution either recirculates or doesn't recirculate is really going to impact the nutrient selection. So there are two main kind of generalizations we can make on system type, and those would be open and closed systems. An open system is one where you mix your nutrient solution in a reservoir and it goes out through irrigation and is applied to the plants. And then from there, anything that the plants don't take up is drained away. So that solution is only applied to the plants the one time. This is really great for long-term fruiting crops that are going to have those changing nutrient demands. It's going to be difficult to change the nutrient solution over time. So being able to have that flexibility in completely replacing what's in your reservoir and going out to your plants allows a little bit more fine tuning of your nutrient plan. And then you have closed systems, which is a little bit more ideal for slightly shorter term crops and crops that aren't going to go through multiple life stages like your leafy greens. In a closed system, you're going to mix a nutrient solution in a reservoir. It's going to flow out and be applied to your plants. And then it's going to be recaptured and recirculated through the reservoir. Most of these closed systems are managed based on general EC, so you maintain a particular EC level throughout the life of those plants, and you're really able to maximize your water and nutrient use efficiency by applying it multiple times throughout the growing cycle. Now let's dive into solution dynamics a little bit and how we're going to manage these nutrient solutions, whether it be in a closed or open system. So the basic parameters that we always want to keep an eye on are going to be your solution pH, alkalinity, EC, and the specific concentrations of individual nutrients. So on our lab tests, we test for all of these. You'll see at the top, we test for EC, pH, and alkalinity. This is an example of a particular water source that had a slightly elevated pH and a good bit of alkalinity. So how does solution pH and alkalinity affect plant nutrient availability and uptake? Solution pH is the measure of the hydrogen ion concentration in solution. It's what you're going to use to decide if your solution is acidic or basic. The overall pH range has a scale from 0 to 14, with 7 being considered neutral. But there's a much smaller range where the elements that plants are going to require for growth are actually soluble and available to your plants. For most crops, that range is going to be about 5.5 to 6.5. And then plants can actually change the pH of their solution over time as they take up nutrients. So, what's really important to know is what is being supplied to your plants and being able to estimate how those changes are going to occur. As plants take up positively charged nutrients, that's going to release positively charged cations back into the solution, which will lower the pH over time. And then alternatively, as plants take up nutrients that are negatively charged, that's going to kick off negatively charged anions into solution and raise the pH over time. So kind of gauging how your solution pH is changing can give you a little bit of an idea which nutrients the plants are taking up. And then we have solution alkalinity. Alkalinity is very closely related to pH, but it's not the same. They're not a measure of each other. They just typically go hand in hand. Solution alkalinity is a measure of the buffering capacity in the water. So if you have very high alkalinity in your solution, you're not going to see significant pH changes over time. But if you do need to change your pH, it's going to take a lot more acid or base to be able to adjust the pH. Whereas if you have very low alkalinity water or nutrient solution, it's going to be very easy to change and adjust your pH, but it also could swing pretty significantly on its own. And so you want to be kind of mindful of how those solution changes happen, especially if you have a low alkalinity. You want to stay on top of making sure that pH is staying in range for those crops. And then we have solution EC. This is a measure of all of the soluble salts that are in your solution. So many nutrient solutions are managed based on maintaining a certain EC level. This is a very good gauge of the strength of your nutrient solution. But the biggest issue is that it's not an indication of individual nutrient levels. So whenever you're mixing a fresh nutrient solution, you can kind of get a good idea of, the specific nutrient levels based on what you have read on the fertilizer label. But over time, especially in recirculating systems, two different solutions can have the same EC but have very different nutrient concentrations. Which is why it's also important whenever you send in a sample for analysis that you're mindful of the nutrient breakdown as well. You could have one solution very high in nitrogen and another solution with almost no nitrogen, but say a lot of calcium, and they show up as the same EC. So you really need to be mindful of what's actually being supplied to the plants over time. And then we kind of get into water quality. Water quality really significantly impacts your nutrient selection. So, for example, you compare pure and what we call hard water sources. Hard water sources typically have higher calcium, some of them have higher pH as well. So, whenever you are looking at selecting a fertilizer, you always want to get your source water tested first. If you have a hard water source that does contain a lot of calcium, then you may be able to utilize that free calcium that's already available in your water and select a lower calcium fertilizer. Whereas if you have a really pure water source, you want to make sure that you're supplying plenty of calcium and all those other nutrients that would usually be supplied from a very hard water source. And then you also want to be careful and make sure that there isn't a lot of sodium and chloride in your water source. So, as I was saying earlier with measuring EC, you could have two different water sources that have very similar EC, but one has lots of calcium and another has a lot of sodium. And they would show up as the same EC reading. Sodium and chloride at low levels usually do not pose a problem, but as they accumulate, especially in recirculating systems, they can significantly impact the EC of a solution. And they also compete with other nutrients for uptake. So your plants, may be taking up these ions, but they're not actually getting the nutrients that they need to grow and thrive. And as I mentioned, most recirculating solutions are managed based on maintaining a certain EC. For most CEA crops, that EC is somewhere between 1 and 2.5. But as we mentioned in, our selection slides, that is very kind of crop and system dependent. You want to be mindful of running at a very low EC. Lower ECs, if you're kind of checking your solution and you notice that the EC is continually being low, that indicates a lack of nutrients and that you need to add more fertilizer and very quickly. Low EC definitely can induce nutrient deficiencies as the plants are kind of struggling to reach for nutrients to take up. And on the flip side of that, if you're noticing that the EC in your nutrient solution tends to climb, you may have some sort of excess nutrient or an excess contaminant like sodium or chloride that's really adding to the EC. And what's odd is that, a high EC can also induce nutrient deficiency. As nutrients become imbalanced, plants are unable to take up all of the nutrients that they need in, a really balanced way to facilitate plant growth. So you really want to definitely get solutions tested and make sure that you know what that nutrient breakdown looks like. And now we're going to talk about the importance of raw materials and raw material quality whenever you're selecting a fertilizer, because this will make a big difference overall. Whenever you're selecting a fertilizer, you always want to check the derived from statement that's listed on the fertilizer labels. This is actually required on all fertilizer labels, and it's a list of the raw materials that the individual nutrients are sourced from. So this is an example of our 6626 label, and you'll see the derived from statement is located directly below the guaranteed analysis. And I blew it up a little bit so you can see it a little bit better. And it lists all of the individual raw materials that is in that particular bag of fertilizer. So you can identify where each of the nutrients in the guaranteed analysis is coming from. So there are a couple of kind of red flags to be watching for on derived from statements. The first one that you really want to look for and stay away from would be anything labeled as a muriate. Muriates are chlorides and will add chloride to your nutrient solution. So even if you have very low chloride in your raw water, you could be adding some through the fertilizer without even realizing it. And as I said, chloride, on its own in very low levels is not much of an issue, but if it does accumulate in your nutrient solution, it will compete with nitrate for plant uptake. You also want to watch for soda or sodium. These raw materials supply sodium, which, similar to chloride on its own, not usually a problem, but it is a positively charged ion that competes with calcium, magnesium, and potassium for plant uptake. So you'll see I've pulled some derived from statements from some other fertilizer labels. And these are just examples of kind of what you might see on a fertilizer label as you're kind of shopping around. And there are two here examples that use sodium molybdate as their raw material to supply molybdenum. So molybdenum is a plant essential element. It's a micronutrient. Absolutely should be in there in the fertilizer that's, supplying the nutrients to your plants. But, if you can stay away from a fertilizer that supplies it using sodium molybdate, you absolutely should. And then you also want to watch out for what we call agricultural grade fertilizers. They're still fertilizer, will still supply nutrients to your plants. But in terms of using them in hydroponics, in CEA, in greenhouse grown crops, it's usually less soluble and contains lower quality raw materials. You also want to check for the sources of your micronutrients. There are a couple different options for how micronutrients can be supplied in fertilizer blends. One of them is sulfated micronutrients compared to chelated micronutrients. So, sulfated micronutrients will still supply micronutrients, but they're less soluble than chelated micronutrients, and you have to keep the pH in a very specific range for them to be soluble and available to your plants. Whereas if chelated micronutrients are utilized, that significantly increases the solubility range. So you can allow your pH to fluctuate a little bit more and still be comfortable in knowing that your micronutrients are going to be plant available. So, for example, I've highlighted the chelates here on these fertilizer labels. There are three different types of chelates. There's EDTA, DTPA, and EDDHA, and they significantly increase the range at which the micronutrients are going to be soluble. So EDTA is the most common. It allows for solubility at a pH range from 4 to 6.5. DTPA is the next most common, and it slightly widens it a little bit more to 4 to 7.5. And then, kind of the most expensive and really nice chelate is going to be EDDHA, which supplies that micronutrient at a range from 4 to 9 pH. So you'll see on these fertilizer labels, all their micronutrients are supplied using chelates, and the most common is going to be EDTA. So that would expand the pH range from 4 to 6.5. And then this is an example of our 6626 fertilizer label. You'll see I've highlighted our micronutrients. We only use chelated micronutrients, and we make sure to, especially with iron, to supply iron in all three chelated forms. So we supply iron with EDTA, DTPA, and EDDHA. to make sure that you receive the maximum solubility of iron. And then, as I mentioned, you do want to kind of watch out for agricultural grade fertilizers. These fertilizers are usually available in very large quantities. They're intended for, field crop use, and they typically contain slightly elevated levels of heavy metals and also excess salts like sodium chloride and fluoride. And they also tend to contain unwanted impurities, just particles that aren't necessarily nutrient based, like clay and silt. And these can definitely inhibit the solubility of the overall fertilizer and cause lots of issues with injectors and drip emitters clogging, lots of stock tank precipitation, just not quite as high quality of a grade, and the solubility is definitely much lower. So that kind of wraps up what we were here to talk about today. We have three main key takeaways that, if you learned anything, this is what I want you to know. The first is that fertilizer selection depends on several factors, and that would be crop type, system type, and water quality. You always want to make sure that you know what those are before making fertilizer decisions. The second is that nutrient solutions do need consistent monitoring and adjustment. Especially if you have low alkalinity, changes can happen very quickly. So you need to be able to check and adjust your nutrient solutions before you start noticing any sort of symptoms on your plants to really, reduce or eliminate any potential deficiencies that you might run into. And the last is that high quality plants are grown with high quality fertilizer. So, whenever you're selecting a fertilizer, you want to make sure that you're paying attention to the raw materials that are in that bag and ensure the maximum nutrient solubility so that your plants are always able to have a nutrient source that they can draw from. And with that, we'll wrap up for today. If anyone has any questions, I invite you to, drop them in the Q&A. Otherwise, my name's Lauren. You all know how to reach me. You have my email address, and I'm happy to talk with you at any time.